2, 1. Hello! Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to set up, configure, and use a Raspberry Pi. But first, what is a Raspberry Pi? Well, a Raspberry Pi is this right here. It's what's called an SBC, or a single board computer. And essentially what it is, it's like any other computer, but all the components are on a single, small form factor circuit board that offers a multitude of uses when compared to a traditional computer. Now that we know a little bit about the Raspberry Pi, we can move to setting it up. To set up your Raspberry Pi, you're going to need a few things. First off, you're obviously going to need a Raspberry Pi, which I have right here. Next, you're going to need some sort of display output with an HDMI connection. So that could be a TV, a monitor, really anything, but it just has to have an HDMI connection. And I have one right here with an HDMI cable leading to it. Next, we're going to need some way to power our Raspberry Pi. And the Raspberry Pi makes things simple by having a micro USB cable be its power source. Now, if you've ever had an Android phone, chances are that you have a micro USB cable laying around. Now, to power your Raspberry Pi, all you're going to need to do is plug that micro USB cable into a wall, into another computer with a USB port, and plug it into your Raspberry Pi. So in this case, I just have a micro USB cable that's plugged into the wall to power my Raspberry Pi. Next up, you're going to need some peripherals to be able to control your Raspberry Pi. Now this can be just a USB keyboard and a USB mouse. Now they can be any mice or any keyboards, but they just have to have a USB connection to be able to control the Raspberry Pi. Next, we're going to need some sort of storage option to store both our files and our operating system on our Raspberry Pi. Now this is where your choice can differ, but in this case, I'm going to be using a micro SD card right here. Now this is for a great reason, as the Raspberry Pi simply has a small micro SD slot built into the back, which makes it really easy to simply slot one in and not have any annoying dongles or USB connectors to store your files and OS on a traditional hard drive or, let's say, a thumb drive like this. So using a micro SD card makes it easy and simple to store a vast amount of files in a relatively small space on your Raspberry Pi. Now before we begin to configure a Raspberry Pi, we're just going to need one more thing before we can plug everything in and start to turn on our Raspberry Pi, and that is cooling. Now, because the Raspberry Pi is such a bare bones computer, it doesn't come with any normal cooling solutions that a conventional computer could have. Now this is where we're going to have to get a little crafty or simply purchase something online that will allow us to cool the heat-producing components of our Raspberry Pi. So here I have two solutions that you might find available on for cooling your Raspberry Pi. Here I have what's called an air cooler, and essentially what it does is has heat conductive metals and other alloys that can suck the heat away from the heat producing components of the Raspberry Pi and uses a little fan to blow that heat away. Or I have something much more simpler right here, which is an aluminum heatsink that will sap the heat away from the Raspberry Pi and dissipate it through the air just through the ambient movement of the air around the Raspberry Pi. And that's what we're going to be using today. So we can mount these heat sinks onto the heat producing components of our Raspberry Pi, and we're good to go. All we need to do now is slot in all of our components. I have my micro SD card, my micro USB power supply, my HDMI cable, and then lastly, my mouse and keyboard. And with this, we're ready to turn on our Raspberry Pi. So as our Raspberry Pi is starting up, I'd like to talk about the operating systems that you can use for your Raspberry Pi. See, unlike normal conventional computers, the Raspberry Pi doesn't come with any preloaded operating system that you might get with, let's say, a Macintosh or a Windows 10 computer. Instead, you're going to need to provide your own operating system for the Raspberry Pi. But fear not, because these operating systems are free to download and very easy to use. In this instance, we're going to be using the intended OS for the Raspberry Pi, Raspbian, which is produced and distributed by the creators of the Raspberry Pi. Now, Raspbian is based off an open source software called Linux, and it's very, very easy to use. If you're familiar with pretty much any other operating system out there, you're going to be familiar with Raspbian. Now that we're in the Raspbian, when we're in the Raspbian Desktop, you can take a look and see like it's like any other operating system that you might be familiar with. For example, on the top right, you have your time, your volume control, your wireless and Bluetooth settings. All of this is usually in the same spot when compared to Windows 10 or Macintosh. On the left, we have our applications that come preloaded with Raspbian. We have programming environments ranging from more difficult languages such as Java and Python to more simplistic languages like Scratch. We even have games on this, such as Minecraft, intended directly for the Raspberry Pi and its hardware specifications. We even have some utility programs that can allow you to, let's say, overclock your Raspberry Pi to achieve higher performance, or fix issues and fix malware that might be installed on your computer. All of it's right here in Raspbian. So with this little quick tour of Raspbian, I hope that you can see that Raspbian is like any other operating system. It's quick, efficient, and uses the same style that many other operating systems that are popular today still use. So now that we've set up our Raspberry Pi, and I've given you a short tour about Raspbian, it's very easy to see that configuring a Raspberry Pi is simple. Because Raspbian is almost like any other operating system, it's easy to download programs, run games, configure your wireless and Bluetooth settings. All that sort of stuff can be easily configured with Raspbian with the Raspberry Pi. So now that we've gone through setting up the Raspberry Pi and configuring it, we can move into some of the uses of the Raspberry Pi. And one of the most apparent is just its use as a general computer, because the Raspberry Pi is quite inexpensive given the amount of potential that this computer can bring. A normal Raspberry Pi costs around $5 to $10, depending on which model you get. And with this much performance and utility, it's easy to see how this can be a wonderful investment for just a day-to-day normal computer. If you want to surf the web, watch YouTube videos, and just do light computing, this is the computer for you. Let's say you want to get a grandparent to be able to connect with relatives via an inexpensive computer, but don't want to have to waste time with purchasing a pre-built computer and having to fork over tons of cash for all that. The Raspberry Pi is a great answer. It allows you to configure it for its needs and use it in pretty much any general computing task. And again, with its price tag of $5 to $10, it's a great option for any general computing task. Another place where the Raspberry Pi shines is its small form factor. Now, I kind of alluded to this earlier in this presentation, but because the Raspberry Pi's small size, it brings a variety of uses to the table. Now, this Raspberry Pi can fit in areas where other computers can't, making it a great option for, let's say, a weather monitoring station, a security camera, a DIY security camera system. Just with these few ideas, you can see that with the small form factor of the Raspberry Pi, it's simply that your imagination that is the limit to the amount of uses with the Raspberry Pi. Another thing I'd like to mention about with uses of the Raspberry Pi is these small pins that are on the bottom of the Raspberry Pi. Now, unlike normal computers, which might just be able to communicate with other devices through, let's say, USB, these pins, which are called Gpio pins, allow the Raspberry Pi to communicate with virtually any other electronic device. This can range from, let's say, a light bulb to maybe something more complex, such as a solenoid valve controlling a pressure in a tank, or anything like that. The uses are pretty much endless in this scenario. For example, right here, I have what's called a hat, or hardware on top. This connects via the GPIO interface and allows the Raspberry Pi to gain additional sensors. So this one has a LCD panel, a hydrometer, a barometer, a temperature sensor, all this stuff just onto one small circuit board. And with this in mind, you can see the enormous use case just stemming from the GPIOs. So now that I've gone through the setup, configuring process, and some of the uses of the Raspberry Pi, I encourage you to perhaps invest in a Raspberry Pi and explore the world of computing through an inexpensive and very useful computer. Thank you.